The air hung thick over Belrive in the summer of 1851, smelling perpetually of molasses, wet earth, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. It was a suffocating beauty, where the Spanish moss dripped like tears from ancient oaks and the relentless sun bleached the ambition out of a man's bones. Every rustle of the cane leaves sounded like a whispered threat, a confirmation that surveillance was eternal. The scent of boiled sugar, the plantation's economic lifeblood, was inescapable, coating the throat and the skin, a constant reminder of the forced labor that sustained the estate. The earth itself seemed to be exhausted, holding the crushing weight of the cane and the silent weight of human misery under a relentless, blinding sky. The humidity itself seemed to press down on the plantation, turning every physical effort into an act of resistance. Elias moved through the fields with a practiced, almost mechanical grace, his back a map of controlled movement. His movements were so economical, so flawlessly repetitive, that they seemed to blend into the machinery of the plantation itself, eliminating any telltale sign of independent thought. His value lay not just in his immense strength, but in his calculated restraint, a quality the overseer mistook for docility, a sign of a spirit subdued and tamed for the master's leisure. The overseer, a coarse man named Silas, had once remarked that Elias was better than any horse, a crude compliment that Elias recorded internally as a measure of his successful deception. Elias knew better. His control was a shield, a rigid mental architecture built to keep the ever-present violence of the system from shattering his inner self. He had perfected the art of occupying space without presence, of performing labor without revealing thought, making himself functionally indispensable but intellectually invisible to his captors, a living ghost of competence. The psychological discipline required to maintain this facade was far more demanding than the physical labor. Every morning, he performed a silent inventory of his body and mind, checking for any lapse, a moment of distraction, a spontaneous sigh, a tremor of fury, and eradicating it with iron will. He subjected his sensory input to constant, brutal filtration. The stench of the slop bucket, the sizzle of fat in the master's kitchen, the distant shouts of Silas, all were reduced to pure, non-emotional data points. He lived in a state of controlled sensory deprivation, permitting only the specific sounds of the mill and the quiet hum of the night to penetrate his fortress mind. He was a man of quiet intelligence, a fact that made him both prized and perilous on the plantation. Master Jules relied on Elias' head for the intricate work, the maintenance of the sugar mill machinery, the precise timing of the irrigation sluices, work that required a mind they assumed was dulled by servitude, yet feared was sharp with awareness, a terrifying contradiction in their ordered world. Jules, a man driven by immediate, visceral profit, understood that the sheer complexity of the modern sugar production, the high-pressure steam engines, the delicate alignment of the centrifugal filters, the long-draining trenches, required a technical acumen he himself lacked. Jules's understanding ended where the grease began, forcing him to rely completely on Elias' expertise, a dependency that gnawed at the master's pride. Elias was the only one who could hear the subtle, necessary dysfunctions in the mill's massive engine, the silent tremors that signaled impending breakdown months before any white man noticed a dip in efficiency. He knew the age of the main boiler, the weak points in the iron pressure valves, and the cumulative fatigue in the massive main drive shaft, mapping their internal vulnerabilities like a battlefield. This awareness was a dangerous secret, a hidden sovereignty over the plantation's economic heart. 3 nights a week, under the deepest cloak of moonless dark, Elias used his knowledge of the mill's shadows and the night watchman's predictable cough to slip away. His body was a precision instrument of movement, navigating the damp, twisting paths without disturbing a single firefly or the sleeping dogs, moving by the unseen geography of memory and sound. He kept a tiny, hidden cache of salvaged paper and charcoal, items that were more valuable and subversive than any weapon. The paper, carefully smoothed and ironed to remove telltale wrinkles, and the charcoal, meticulously sharpened and wrapped in oilskin, represented the forbidden tools of liberation, the power to formalize thought and transmit knowledge beyond the reach of the spoken word, creating an archive of defiance. The oilskin wrapping itself was a critical detail, protecting the charcoal from the aggressive humidity that would otherwise turn the fragile writing medium to mud. This small act of engineering proved his relentless focus on preserving the tools of his quiet war against the environment and the slave codes, every detail a victory over the forces determined to keep them ignorant. In a dilapidated shed near the bayou, a place ignored due to its swarms of mosquitoes and the persistent smell of decay, Elias taught. 5, sometimes 6, others gathered, their eyes hungry in the gloom, absorbing the shapes of letters, the alchemy of words. It was a capital offense, an act of rebellion executed with silent chalk strokes and hushed breaths, the very air in the shed thick with the shared danger and the desperate hope of literacy. His students were the ones Elias deemed most able to endure the psychological strain of forbidden knowledge. The young, quick-witted field hand who could memorize long passages, the quiet laundry woman who moved between the house and the cabins and could carry messages, and the scarred, older man who remembered the narratives of their ancestral homes and anchored their lessons in history, providing context for their fight. Elias taught them that the alphabet was the first key to unlock the mind, allowing them to decipher the master's contracts, the abolitionist pamphlets rumored to cross the state lines, and ultimately, the map to freedom itself. Every lesson was a calculated risk, a direct challenge to the system built on enforced ignorance, a tiny, defiant seed of self-ownership planted in the hostile, poisoned soil of Bel Reve. Madame Aurore, the master's wife, was a different kind of tyrant than her husband. Where Jules used the whip and the threat of the block, relying on pain and spectacle, Aurore specialized in slow, psychological corrosion. Her weapon was the control of the internal world, the destruction of moral and mental space, twisting the victim's own intellect against them. She was frail, cloaked in silk, and obsessed with an absolute, suffocating order that mirrored the rigid discipline of the house. She demanded the arrangement of flowers in the grand salon be refreshed precisely every 24 hours, and the dusting of ancestral portraits be perfect to the microsecond, ensuring that no object, living or inanimate, was allowed to exist outside her precise, fragile aesthetic, a desperate attempt to contain the wild nature she feared. Her favorite ritual was the daily review of the estate ledgers, a symbolic act of mastery over the profits generated by bodies she never saw. She often summoned Elias to the library to verify the mill's output figures, placing him deliberately close to her, in the rarefied air of mahogany and leather, a calculated intrusion that blurred the dangerous lines of her power, forcing him to witness her dominion over his productivity and his intrinsic worth. Elias stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the mahogany floorboards, speaking only when addressed, his voice low and precise, clipped to the minimum necessary words. Aurore didn't fear him. She was fascinated by his stillness, by the visible effort of his control, recognizing in him a mirror of her own relentless internal discipline, though employed for opposite ends. She saw his intelligence as a perfect tool, a keen edge she could utilize, and in doing so, claim dominion over his mind, a prize more coveted than his body or his labor. By possessing his intellect, she felt she possessed a piece of the rebellious genius she saw reflected in the forbidden books on her shelves, vicariously engaging with forbidden power, projecting her own desires onto his controlled existence. One blisteringly hot afternoon, while Elias was confirming the molasses yield in the library, Aurore's eyes drifted past the numbers and focused on a tiny smudge of charcoal beneath his fingernail. It was the residue of the night's clandestine lesson, a fingerprint of his secret life, a dark speck of rebellion on the pristine landscape of her control, a flaw she could exploit. Her expression did not change. She simply ran a pale, cold finger down the column of figures he had written, lingering over the final sum of profit his labor provided, a silent assertion that she owned the fruit of his mind. Elias felt a spike of pure, crystalline dread, a cold wash that momentarily overwhelmed the discipline he relied on to keep his muscles from twitching, his breath from catching. It was the deepest fear, the recognition that his secret had been cataloged and filed, ready for future use, making him entirely vulnerable. Aurora dismissed him with a curt nod, her voice as smooth as river glass, yet the moment was a new knot tightening around his neck. He knew she hadn't missed the charcoal. She had recognized the signature of his private rebellion, and now, the rules of their quiet war had changed from simple servitude to a deadly game of intellectual leverage, where his students were the ultimate collateral in a battle of wills. He returned to his cabin, the familiar dread coalescing into a desperate need for caution. He immediately canceled the next 3 reading sessions, citing a fictional, sudden shift in the night watchman's route, using the cover of a false discipline to protect his actual defiance. Elias recognized Aurora's strategy. She wouldn't expose him and lose her psychological advantage. She would exploit him, using his secret as the ultimate, non-transferable bond of control. The true nature of her surveillance was revealed a week later. Aurora summoned him again, not to the library, but to the master's private study, a room Elias only entered for severe, formal instruction. The room was heavy with the scent of tobacco and brandy, a masculine chaos that contrasted sharply with Aurora's disciplined parlor, making the intrusion feel even more significant, a forced confrontation with 2 different modes of power. On the desk, nestled among financial documents and a silver inkwell, lay a partially dried reed, the exact type he used for chalking letters in the shed. The small, insignificant object was a massive, silent threat, a trophy of her penetration into his internal world, a complete failure of his security perimeter that proved her reach was absolute and immediate, extending into the most remote corners of the plantation. "You have a fine hand, Elias," she remarked, her eyes bright with a dangerous amusement resting on the reed. "But you must remember, only the master's words are written here. The paper is reserved for his dominion." She had found the shed, but she had only taken a token, a silent declaration that the secret was now hers to wield, a private currency of power she would not spend carelessly, preferring to let him suffer the weight of the knowledge and the constant threat of exposure. Elias could not panic. Panic was submission. He stared at the reed, then at her, and with an unreadable discipline he replied, "Understood, madame. The tool will be retired." It was a moment of profound psychological engagement, a silent bargain struck over the survival of his hidden community, an agreement to play her game on her terms, conceding the loss of the shed to protect the infinitely more valuable lessons held in his mind. Aurora had chosen to protect the secret, not out of mercy, but out of a perverse desire to control something utterly forbidden and purely hers, making his forbidden genius her private spectacle. Her power over him was now absolute, rooted in the knowledge that one word could destroy his life's work and the lives of those he taught. This secret control was her only true excitement in the stagnant, suffocating life of the plantation mistress, a dangerous, thrilling break from her own rigid schedule. Elias' days became a careful dance of perfection. He worked the mill with flawless execution, anticipating malfunctions before they occurred, sometimes preemptively performing complex repairs that saved Jules vast sums, further solidifying his functional indispensable status. He managed the stable hands with quiet authority, creating a flawless shield of productivity. This perfection was exhausting, every motion a lie performed for his overseers, a constant drain on his physical and mental reserves. He endured Aurora's increasingly intimate demands on his time, not physical, but intellectual. She forced him to debate philosophy, challenging his opinions on Aristotle and the romantic poets she imported from Paris, specifically focusing on texts that dealt with the legal definitions of property and humanity. She would press him on the nature of Enlightenment thinking. The selection of texts was a deliberate cruelty. She made him read excerpts from Montesquieu on the separation of powers and Rousseau on the social contract, then demanded he synthesize the arguments and apply them to the immutable structure of the plantation. She reveled in the impossible intellectual paradox she forced him to navigate, believing that the frustration would eventually break his disciplined mind. She treated him as a prized artifact of mind, a captive scholar, trapped in a body she owned, forcing him to engage with the very literature that discussed the rights of man and the nature of liberty. She would spend hours dissecting the structure of Virgil's Aeneid, demanding Ilias analyze the moral implications of destiny versus free will, knowing the irony was a knife twisting in his gut, a constant reminder of his bondage and her intellectual supremacy. She seemed to take a venomous delight in forcing him to use his keen mind to articulate his own degradation, demanding elegant syntax and sophisticated arguments about chattel principles. He was made to argue the logical necessity of his own enslavement using the language of logic and reason, a profound and sickening form of intellectual bondage. This was the golden leash, binding him with the very capacity for abstract thought she admired and feared, making his intellect her psychological prisoner. The more brilliantly he argued for a poet's vision of universal justice, the tighter her control became, for she was the one who permitted that thought to exist. Her power derived from her complete, knowing awareness of the scope of his internal resistance. The psychic cost of this internal duality was immense. By day, he was the perfect automaton, the disciplined slave, performing intellectual servitude, a man without emotion or private self, his inner life walled off behind a perfect mask of granite. By night, he was the teacher, the whisperer of freedom, the quiet revolutionary, shouldering the weight of his students' futures, the one thread of true existence he held onto. He adopted a unique coping mechanism. He treated every debate with Aurore as a mental exercise, a sparring match where the goal was not to win the argument, but to refine his own thinking and maintain his emotional distance. He filed away her weaknesses, her vanity, her lack of genuine insight for later use, turning the library into a classroom for his own strategic mind. The pressure of maintaining two such contradictory existences, both under Aurore's shadow, threatened to tear his mind apart, leaving him with an acute sense of moral vertigo and constant exhaustion that only his self-imposed discipline could manage. His self-control was the dam holding back a flood of despair and rage. His memory became his most vital asset, holding the lessons and the escape plans in a mental vault where Aurore could not reach. He had to be perfect because he understood that Aurore was waiting, patiently, for the moment his composure would crack, for the flicker of weakness that would allow her to assert her dominion, and finally break the man beneath the perfect slave, ending his long, private war and destroying his clandestine community. One evening, Jules, frustrated by a poor yield report from the fields, vented his rage in the courtyard. The heat of the day and the financial pressure had made him volatile and desperate for a scapegoat. He was tired of the slow, methodical failure of the harvest, and he needed a quick, visceral outlet for his incompetence to reassure himself of his own mastery over the human element. The increasing financial tension was already manifesting. Jules had been drinking more heavily, his face etched with deeper lines of worry, not just greed. The recent, imperceptible mill sabotage was already extracting a subtle tax, forcing the mill to operate slightly hotter, demanding more fuel for the same output, an efficiency drop that Jules blamed on the heat and the laziness of the hands. The target was Jeremiah, an elderly hand whose strength was failing but whose spirit remained stubbornly unbroken, a man too old to be efficiently productive but too proud to be easily crushed by the weight of the system. The beating was brief but brutal, a calculated spectacle intended to remind everyone that the system's power was corporeal, not philosophical. The raw, screaming assertion that the whip was the ultimate source of authority, echoing the methodical violence that maintained the entire economic structure of the region, was intended to silence any latent thoughts of resistance. The rhythmic thwack was the brutal metronome of Belle Reve, demanding compliance from every corner of the plantation. Elias was forced to watch, standing rigid among the other slaves, his eyes dry, his face a mask of stone, performing the demanded subservience with inhuman perfection. His discipline held. His body did not flinch, but inside the constant low-level dread spiked into a furious, cold determination. He knew the systemic cruelty of the whipping was not just punishment, but a deliberate attempt to break the internal architecture of hope and unity, to prove that collective resistance was futile, leaving only submission. That night Elias did not go to the shed. He went to the mill, where the great iron gears sat silent and slick with grease, radiating a cold, industrial power, the only force on the plantation that responded purely to physics, not emotion. He had studied the mechanism for years, understanding its every flaw and strength, a knowledge that gave him temporary dominion over the master's most valuable asset, the literal engine of their wealth, the source of Jules's overweening power. He enacted a plan he had kept dormant for months, refined over hundreds of hours of silent observation. It was not a destructive act. Destruction was easily discovered and brutally avenged, the consequence immediate and traceable. It was an act of subtle sabotage, a tiny, almost invisible change to the alignment of the main crushing gears, the consequence of which would not be realized for weeks, maybe months, a revenge executed in slow motion with engineering genius. Using specialized knowledge of metal fatigue and thermal expansion, acquired through years of necessary maintenance, Elias made a microscopic adjustment to the main bearing housing with a small, specialized tool he had forged from a broken carriage axle, a tool only he could recognize by its perfectly calibrated edge. The change was undetectable to the naked eye or even a cursory inspection by Jules's simple mechanics, but it shifted the rotational dynamics just enough to create an insidious, deep-seated friction. The friction was calculated to cause the mill to shudder almost imperceptibly at peak operating temperature, slowly generating metal dust and accelerating the wear on the main shaft. This silent, corrosive process was already underway, evidenced by the slightly higher temperature of the main drive bearings, a fact Jules dismissed as a ventilation issue rather than a mechanical failure. The gears would still crush the cane, masking the initial damage with the noise of daily operations, but they would grind together with microscopic imperfection, slowly but surely eating away at their own teeth, generating imperceptible metal dust that would circulate within the oil. This would require a massive, complex, and ruinously expensive replacement months down the line, timed to occur precisely when the next harvest was due and profits were critical, guaranteeing a severe financial shock. Elias returned to his cabin, feeling a dangerous, exhilarating calm. He had responded to the raw violence of the plantation with the precision of a clockmaker. He had used his intelligence, the very tool Auror coveted, to strike back in a way that would be blamed on mechanical fatigue, not human resistance, an invisible wound on the master's ledger that would bleed slowly and devastatingly, destroying Jules's confidence in his own machinery. The following morning, Auror called him to the house. She did not speak of the mill, the sabotage, a quiet, ticking time bomb in the belly of the beast. Instead, she spoke of Jeremiah, the man beaten the night before. He is old, Elias. He requires care. The master cannot afford sentimentality, and the sight of him undermines the authority of the overseer. Her tone was detached, administrative, focusing only on the efficient removal of a broken resource from the sight of the profitable hands. She instructed Elias to move Jeremiah to the smokehouse, a cold, isolated structure generally used for curing meats, far from the warmth of the cabins, ensuring his suffering was unseen. She framed it as a compassionate relocation, but Elias knew the truth. The smokehouse was cold, damp, and lacked proper ventilation, a slow-death sentence wrapped in the language of mercy and efficiency, designed to remove the spectacle of a broken man while maintaining a facade of managerial competence. Elias saw the ultimate sophistication of her cruelty. By ordering him to oversee the slow decline of the injured man, she forced him to participate in the moral corrosion of the system, forcing his disciplined efficiency to serve her malice. She was testing his control, trying to break his spirit through complicity and enforced despair, making him choose between his self-preservation and his human compassion. He moved Jeremiah, cleaning his wounds with meticulous care, relying on his knowledge of basic first aid learned from a healer years ago. He moved with an urgency that belied his controlled exterior, knowing that every moment of delay could mean infection. He whispered words of comfort he dared not speak in the light, relying on the predictable silence of the midday sun when most were in the fields. He brought the man small, pilfered portions of medicinal herbs he ground himself from plants he knew grew hidden in the bayou, along with the news of the reading circle. The news, a brief, vital report on the progress of their lessons, proof that hope was still alive, was the best medicine. Jeremiah, despite his pain, became a covert communication hub, a place where news and hope were exchanged under the guise of medical treatment. Elias devised a system using the placement of Jeremiah's water tin outside the smokehouse door. If the tin was upright, the night was safe for travel. If it was overturned, an unscheduled patrol was due. This small, mundane detail became a critical piece of their internal security network. In these tiny, concealed acts of defiance, the stolen medicine, the whispered news, the gentle application of salves, Elias maintained the integrity of his inner self, fighting Auror's psychological assault by creating a pocket of unauthorized humanity. He built a small, internal sanctuary around Jeremiah, a secret garden of human kindness in the plantation's wasteland, hidden by the very schedule meant to expose him. Auror's grip tightened further. She now required Elias to spend every Sunday afternoon in the study, assisting her in classifying books for her private collection. The task was pointless, a tedious system of cross-referencing authors by continent, genre, and date of first publication, designed purely to consume his only day of rest and mental freedom, leaving him completely exhausted for the week ahead. She forced him to create elaborate index cards, written in his perfect hand, cross-referencing every edition of every volume, a monument to scholarly vanity. This intrusion was the final piece of her power structure, the golden leash fully deployed, a complete siege on his intellectual time. By monopolizing his mind and his time, she eliminated the possibility of his escape, his rebellion, or his rest. The intellectual engagement was a deliberate, subtle torment, forcing him to engage with the concepts of freedom and knowledge he risked his life to share, while simultaneously denying him the time to plan his rebellion. He cataloged treatises on the ethics of governance, all while remaining an object of property within a system that rendered him ungoverned and unfree. Elias endured the Sunday ritual with the same granite stillness he displayed in the fields, his face a perfect blank canvas while his mind was a whirlwind of calculations and geography. While his hands moved through the books, cataloging their titles, his mind was constructing new lessons, memorizing the constellations visible from the smokehouse window as navigational tools, charting escape routes not just for himself, but for the reading circle. He used the books themselves as mnemonic aids, anchoring segments of the escape route to specific geographical works, using the names of foreign cities and mythological places as reliable, non-traceable memory markers for the final journey north. He assigned each student a code name based on a Greek philosophical concept, ensuring even if they were overheard, the content of their conversation would be meaningless to a listener. The memory of the philosophical debates was used to construct the moral framework for his impending, massive act of chaos. He realized the true horror of his situation. His discipline was not just a defense against the master's violence, but a necessary performance for the mistress's sanity. His perfect obedience fed her need for control, keeping her watchful eye focused on the house, away from the bayou shed and the sick man, a dangerous and necessary symbiosis that could snap at any moment. His work in the mill, his patient care of Jeremiah, his silent study with Auror. All were elements of a complex, three-dimensional game of chess against the plantation regime. Every move had to be perfect, because failure meant not just death, but the end of hope and the betrayal of his commitment to his hidden community, an outcome he would not permit. The whip lay dormant, but its shadow stretched over every hour of his life, a constant psychological flail. That omnipresent threat was the engine of his iron control, a constant reminder that any lapse in discipline, a misplaced word, a moment of visible fatigue, could result in catastrophic reprisal, not just for him, but for Jeremiah and the students in the shed. Elia's final strategy crystallized during a silent, 3-hour cataloging session, where Auror only once lifted her eyes from her embroidery to correct his placement of a Latin grammar text. He knew the mill's mechanical sabotage would eventually reveal itself in a burst of destructive noise and molten metal, leading to immediate suspicion and investigation, destroying the delicate balance he had achieved. The slow sabotage was the ignition, but the flood would be the necessary cover. The financial pressure on Jules was mounting visibly. He had begun snapping at overseers over minor expenses and was seen poring over loan documents, the mill's growing inefficiency gnawing at his capital. The time was ripe for the diversion. He needed a distraction, an event so massive and sudden that it would temporarily paralyze the plantation's system of surveillance and control, granting his reading circle the window they needed to flee. The distraction could not be violent. It had to be a failure of the environment, a collapse of the very natural order Auror believed she commanded, and Jules thought he had mastered, a tragedy beyond human accountability, a true act of God that would absolve human suspicion. He began studying the low water marks of the bayou, the signs of the seasonal shift in the river's flow, and the plantation's inadequate flood defenses. Jules, in his arrogance and greed, had dismissed the old warnings of the local free people about the river's habits, relying instead on cheap, hastily constructed levees, a fundamental flaw Elias intended to exploit, using Jules's own hubris against him and harnessing the power of the overlooked natural world. He observed the subtle hydrostatic pressure against the levee, the soil composition of the river bank, and the precise velocity of the current after a heavy inland rain, calculating the maximum stress points where the earth was weakest due to poor compaction. He knew the river was a patient, relentless enemy, and Jules had given it an opening. Elias decided he would use the water, the ultimate symbol of chaos, as his weapon, deploying its raw, unpredictable power with engineered precision, turning the river into an accomplice and the plantation into a swamp. He would use the power of nature to restore a balance that man had destroyed. He would orchestrate a breach, a slow, controlled flooding of the cane fields that would appear as a natural disaster, a failure of the river bank, not human hands. He calculated the necessary depth of the trench, the required timing of the high water crest, and the exact moment to make the initial cut to ensure the water's erosion, did the rest of the work silently, convincingly, overwhelming the plantation's capacity to respond quickly. The water would rise slowly at first, giving the appearance of normal swelling, then accelerating to catastrophic failure in the dead of night, a terrifying crescendo of rushing water. The subsequent chaos of moving the cane, the loss of the harvest, and the financial shock would consume the master and the mistress entirely, forcing their focus outward, away from the small, vital truth of the bayou shed and the smokehouse. The flood would be their ultimate lesson in the limits of their control, a financial and emotional catastrophe that would eclipse any concern about a few missing people. His discipline was now directed toward mastering the chaotic power of the water. He measured the thickness of the retaining wall using a long, calibrated reed taken during his work near the sluices, calculated the exact sequence of cuts and trenches needed to initiate a gradual, non-obvious failure, and timed it to the season's predicted high-water crest, which was only a few weeks away. Following a series of heavy storms he had tracked through the almanacs of Auror's library. The risk was total, requiring him to be in the bayou at the height of the storm, working in chest-deep, surging water with only a shovel and a prayer. He planned to open a small, crucial weak point in the levee's foundation, a subtle tear in the fabric of the earth, allowing the water to begin its slow, destructive seep hours before the main crest, ensuring the eventual collapse looked gradual and catastrophic, a tragic inevitability that no human could have prevented. He had chosen the night of the new moon, when the darkness would be absolute and his actions invisible. He chose the 5 members of the reading circle, providing them with memorized codes, a series of knocks, and a specific sequence of musical notes he had taught them to hum, to recognize a messenger he would send when the flood chaos began. They were to follow the old, deep forest route, marked by symbols Elias had discreetly carved into ancient oak trunks over years, symbols that appeared to be natural scarring or animal claw marks, using the language of the wilderness as their guide. He instructed the laundry woman, his most discreet messenger, to go to Jeremiah first. Jeremiah would then use a system of coughs, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short, to signal the chosen 5 in the cabins that the final move was imminent. His illness was now their secret language, turning his suffering into a tool for freedom, a last act of resistance that gave his pain a purpose. He realized he would have to wait behind, overseeing the futile effort to save the mill, standing by Jules as the water consumed his wealth, maintaining the stone of certainty facade long enough for their tracks to be completely washed away by the water's furious current. His knowledge of the machinery would make him invaluable during the salvage effort, ironically becoming the final, indispensable servant of the system he was destroying by seeming to protect it. Elias had become the stone of certainty himself, a monument of control dedicated to freedom. His final, terrible act of obedience was the necessary cover for his act of ultimate defiance, the perfect performance of servitude designed to camouflage a revolution built on water, darkness, and the power of the written word. His body would remain, his mind perfectly subservient to the master's commands in the moments of chaos, but his heart would already be running toward the north with his students, having found true freedom in the absolute sovereignty of his own disciplined will. The cane fields would drown, but their spirits would fly free.